YouTube. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nafia Khan, and I'm with Hope Fair Housing Center. We are what we call a fair housing agency or a fair housing initiatives program, which is a designation which indicates that my agency provides services in the form of enforcement and outreach for folks experiencing housing discrimination. And today we're going to be discussing fair housing rights, specifically for survivors of domestic violence. I would like to also start this presentation by letting you all know that this is not legal information. Rather, this is outreach and education, meaning these are all resources and we're going to be going through the rights of folks impacted. But again, please just note that we always highly recommend, and we do recommend, that you always reach out to us in our intake line so we can put you in touch with the fair housing lawyer if you would like any follow-up on specifically legal advice. So thank you so much for that. Just before we start talking about fair housing rights, especially when it comes to survivors of DV, one of the things we do is try to clarify with any acronyms or terms that we use, because I don't want to assume, we'd never want to assume anybody has any familiarity with housing discrimination rights. And so when I say HUD, I will be discussing the U.S. Department on Housing and Urban Development. When I say PHA, that is an acronym for a public housing agency. So that's like our housing authority. And when we refer to the FHA, I'll be discussing the Fair Housing Act. Again, the Fair Housing Act is that federal level protection against housing discrimination. And finally, and this is very important because this was renewed during the Obama administration, the VAWA, and that's called the Violence Against Women Act. These are all just a few of the terms that we use in fair housing, and mostly it's because it helps us keep track of which agency is responsible for what enforcement. So we already know this from the first presentation that I gave for the affiliates with Church World Services, but fair housing definition is pretty simple. Fair housing is where the people, as in all people, regardless of what community you belong to, you have the right to live where you choose, that you have full access to your housing, whatever that housing looks like, right? For some people, it's a home. For some people, it's an apartment or condo. We believe in having accessible, safe, affordable housing. And then, of course, enjoying the full use of your home. And then we also, when we talk about fair housing, we also really highly talk about the actions that are not lawful. So you have the right to housing without being discriminated against, having your housing interfered with, being coerced, threatened, or intimidated. And by the way, this also includes the same protections against these things when you file a fair housing complaint. So under fair housing law, you're also allowed to report any, as far as like if you're being interfered with, if you're being threatened or coerced or intimidated, you also can file a fair housing complaint. And if you are experiencing those things, you can report it. We know that fair housing has a lot of repercussions when it comes to life outcomes. And we know that where you live affects access to job opportunities, to things like healthcare and public transportation. We know that access to grocery stores and clean air and water, as well as emergency resources and services, also impact people's livelihoods. And so we just want to kind of iterate that fair housing is also really talking about all these other intersections, right? Things like healthcare and access to transportation and clean air and water, which are all human rights. And just, you'll hear me say this throughout the presentation, but Hope believes, like everyone else, that housing is a human right. And as such, it should be protected to the full extent of our laws. Now we're going to get into more legal protections. So as I mentioned, we have the Federal Fair Housing Act, and this is the federal legislation that agencies like mine are responsible for enforcing. And that is where it is the legislation that prohibits discrimination in renting, leasing, purchasing, selling, or living in a home because of your membership in what we call a protected class. The way that I describe what a federal and state protected class Just to clarify, on the left-hand side, for those, just for access purposes, I'm going to be speaking state protected classes in Illinois because that is where Hope provides services at. We can talk offline, and I'm happy to provide material on specific other state protected classes that have to deal with additional fair housing protections. So I'm just going to be discussing what Illinois as well as the federal government has for protections in place. Under federal fair housing law, if you are experiencing discrimination based on your race, disability, religion, familial status, sex or gender identity, sexual orientation, or you're being sexually harassed, as well as your national origin and color, those are all considered federal protected classes. And simultaneously, every state, for the most part, depending on which state it is, and obviously this is all based on laws that are passed. We have various factors like political will and that kind of thing. So we do want to keep in mind that state protected classes also exist. So every state has to recognize the federal protected classes. And for instance, in Illinois, age is a protected class. Something interesting in Illinois, you do not have to be a senior officially on paper to get protected class status. As long as you are over the age of 40, you are protected under that age class. So I found that really interesting. Illinois already has sexual orientation and gender identity built in. Two things that are really incredibly important: marital status is also protected, and this really big one, order of protection status. As a survivor of domestic violence and family violence in general, there are additional safeguards for survivors at state level government. And Illinois is one of the states where if you are a survivor of domestic violence, and for instance, you took out an order of protection out against your abuser, you are not, you're very much protected under state law. And like a housing provider can't turn you away because, for instance, perhaps you use a voucher to be able to pay for your housing through a transitional program. Maybe you're utilizing services from a domestic violence shelter or a domestic violence services support agency. You cannot be turned away in my state of Illinois because you are a survivor and you are trying to obtain or maintain your housing. So just really important. Also something to note, and this status is also available in some other states, but I am so sorry about the misspelling. Military status. Military status, whether you are a current service member or you are a former service member as a veteran, you are able to not get your housing turned away because you use a voucher. For instance, like the VASH voucher that veterans use, because you use that voucher for your housing. So those are really important protected classes, especially that order of protection status. So just to kind of recap, we talked through the various laws at the federal level that protect survivors. And we also talked a little bit about protected classes. Now we're going to be delving into specific protections when it comes to domestic violence survivors. And this is important to note that domestic violence is actually a fair housing issue. Survivors absolutely deserve and are protected under our laws in this country. And as such, we have to treat it like a fair housing issue. Domestic violence is not exempt from protections. This is a statistic that we find really staggering. In the United States, and this is according to data from the ACLU Women's Rights Project, 92% of homeless mothers have experienced severe physical abuse. So this is just one type of abuse, and it's just really stark, right? There is definitely a correlation of folks that have had to flee domestic violence, and in the process, they become homeless, whether that is for financial reasons. Perhaps they're tied to their abusive partner fiscally, and if they leave, they lose that source of income. Perhaps they are, fleeing domestic violence and they don't have family support. That's another reason that homeless mothers potentially may be ending up on the street. So, and also just keep in mind, these homeless mothers may also have children. So there's a whole other statistic that is not noted in here, but that does exist. I'm sure there is data also being updated for 2021, but also keep in mind that when you are a mother and you have children with you and you're homeless, trying to take care of children in multiple places, especially when you're so transient, also becomes a big barrier to fair housing. Talked a little bit about this already, but domestic violence is in addition to physical violence. Some of this can include manipulation of people's finances, controlling all aspects of a victim's life, I like to say survivor, but in this instance, we're talking about that victim of survivor who becomes a survivor regardless when they leave. Interference with employment. Oh, this last one, or the second to last one, is so incredibly important. Sabotaging housing or housing assistance. It has happened more than once where we or another fair housing agency might get a phone call stating that a survivor of violence has been told and or given an indication that a public housing authority will either like reject or will not be able to accept that person in a program because their abuser may have interfered with their ability of being able to be independent. So that's a really big red flag, especially for survivors, because that's sort of the very basic, right? If housing is a human right and you are a survivor, how can you guarantee that you're going to be safe if your abuser has control over everything you do? Again, one big thing that we want to iterate, safe housing saves lives. Not only does safe housing save the life of mothers that are experiencing violence, but also saves the lives of children that may be the offspring as a result of a domestic violence relationship. Okay, this is really incredibly important. So the next, I am so sorry because I clearly was coming back from my trip from DC from the National Fair Housing Alliance and did not do a spell check correctly. So I want to apologize. I will make sure that I fix these spelling errors before I submit this. So again, common reasons for someone being evicted, especially if they're a survivor. There are these things called zero tolerance crime policies that exist in some housing providers' language. So it's not uncommon where there might be a lease that specifically states that when you apply for housing and you get accepted, that you are not going to be able to call the police for any reasons. And yes, for a survivor, that is really inaccessible. If you have left your spouse or you have left your abuser and or you're trying to leave your abuser and you are told by a housing provider that there's a zero tolerance crime policy, that will negatively impact your ability of being able to secure secure stable, accessible housing. Because what if your abuser is going to be coming after you in that time? Also, disturbance accusations. This is another discriminatory practice which occurs at the housing provider level. There's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of incidences where an abuser will claim that they're, the person who's experiencing violence is the one that's the aggressor. And that's very, very dangerous, especially for children that, are experiencing and seeing this happen in front of them. There's a very likely chance that if the abuser does turn it on the person they're abusing, and then that person gets arrested, then the chances of that person experiencing other barriers to housing, such as an arrest and conviction history, can be very much in question. And so that's another very common reason that survivors may be evicted. This other one is a constant issue we experience in housing providers that have these zero tolerance policies. Zero property damage by the abuser. It is not uncommon where, for instance, if you are a physical aggressor, I apologize, I should have done a content warning for this presentation. Just as a heads up, the content in this presentation might be triggering for some folks. So please exercise, self-care when watching this. It is important to just note that we are going to be talking about abuse and it is a very sensitive topic. Sorry about that. So property damage by the abuser. I'll give you an example. When I lived in Birmingham, there is a property management company that I worked with, to secure my housing. And in my building, unfortunately, there was a spouse downstairs of where my husband and I then lived. And they unfortunately often were the wife in that couple often was screaming, and it was very clear that there was like equipment and like property damage in that apartment. There was constantly noises of people shoving items, a woman screaming while her abuser was doing various movement in the unit. And so property damage by the abuser, it's very likely that if that occurs, then the victim will be told, well, you need to get out of this unit. And now we're in a situation where not only that person becomes homeless, but now they're left to figure out, okay, my abuser just literally, I'm sorry, but screwed me out of housing. Now what do I do? Well, that's where the eviction comes in. So it is not uncommon where we have to figure out how to intervene with somebody who may be calling because they're getting evicted for that property damage. Again, that abuser may have caused that, but because you live in the unit, you by nature, by living there, your rights are then, basically being tarnished. And this is the very, very problematic practice number 4, excessive use of police services. Now, you mentioned earlier that where you live impacts your ability of being able to access emergency services. There are crime-free nuisance ordinances that actually often dictate that this many phone calls to police will get you kicked out. So again, I just sort of want to talk about the fact that if victims of survivors of domestic violence disproportionately are impacted by eviction for these reasons and many more. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind while we go through this. Okay, so we do want to keep this in mind also. Under the Federal Housing Act, survivors of domestic violence are not considered a protected class per se. However, there are protections in place. And like at the federal and state level, as we know, we talked about. More than 8 out of 10 survivors of domestic violence abuse are female. So keep in mind that women disproportionately make up survivors in this country that are experiencing domestic violence. And as such, we do have to look at what we call disparate treatment. Disparate treatment or disparate impact, as we refer to here in this industry, it's basically where there's a neutral policy or a practice that, although it's neutral on its face, it is actually impacting one group of a protected class more than another. It's not about the intention of the policy, it's what the actual impact is. And so when we talk about discriminatory intent here on the left side of this chart, we're talking about the intentional treatment of folks in protected classes being treated differently. On the converse, if somebody is experiencing a neutral policy because, for instance, there's a crime-free ordinance that says, oh, you can only make 5 calls to emergency services within a year. Well, that's going to have a negative impact on the protected class of a survivor. Because again, in Illinois, for instance, order of protection status is a protected class. So although there is protections at the federal level in different ways, it's not that the Fair Housing Act explicitly says that DV survivors are protected. However, there are ways to be able to protect folks regardless in other investigative matters. So an example of this discriminatory treatment or disparate impact. An example would be if a landlord is refusing to rent to a victim because, quote, they always go back to their abusers. A disparate impact in that case, an example would be if there's a 0 tolerance for violence in a clause inside of a lease. In this instance, if a survivor is trying to escape their domestic violence abuser and they're trying to seek housing, but they're told that, well, you can't live here because you're always going to go back to your abusive husband. And then they're going to be able to back that up with a clause in their lease stating that they don't allow 0 tolerance, that they are 0 tolerance for violence. Just want to talk a little bit through state and federal laws. In Illinois, we have a couple different legislation. We have this Safe Homes Act in Illinois. The Safe Homes Act also in my state of Illinois provides additional protections. Like if you're a domestic violence survivor and you are receiving services with like a DV support services agency, like say for instance, you've used shelter services or counseling services, and say for instance, you got a voucher through the support of that agency. Well, if a landlord tries to, tell you, oh no, you can't live here because you received those services. Well, I, as somebody who's a DV survivor and as somebody who is also an agency that supports survivors, I can help protect that person's right and let that landlord know that no, you can't turn that person away from housing. We'll be talking through the Violence Against Women Act shortly. There's also this law that says Forcible Entry and Detainer Act. There's other, additional protections like this law, which essentially if someone comes through your door, it's another way to protect the survivor because that's person, like say for instance, you have your name on a lease of an apartment and somebody comes in, like for instance, your aggressor, that you have the right to be able to, still secure that housing because that person came in unannounced and you did not, that person is like forcibly coming into your home without any sort of, with any sort of repercussion. So I mentioned the Safe Homes Act in Illinois, as I mentioned, it protects survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. Specifically, I meant to mention that it helps people that are renting and then in subsidized housing. So like say for instance, like this does not include like for instance, a public housing like they are in, like a, what's it called? Like a, like if they utilize a housing choice voucher to live somewhere, then they are protected under this law. However, if they're utilizing a public housing, like a housing authority building, that unfortunately the state law doesn't cover them. But it is important to note that that means they have additional protections in our state. So Violence Against Women Act. This is the law specifically talking about, for instance, public housing or federal funded housing. This is a federal law in an application process. So say, for instance, you are basically the people that are protected, someone who has experienced like an abuser who has a history of domestic violence, somebody who's experiencing dating violence, stalking, or sexual assault. So that's, again, when it as it relates to your housing, you are protected if you've experienced these things. In evictions, we talked a little bit about how, various municipal governments try to find ways of bringing barriers against people when they're domestic violence survivors. In some circumstances under this law, you cannot be evicted for the violence of someone else or a threat of violence by someone in your household. Again, this really, really, really is a narrow definition, and there's like specific exceptions to this rule, but it honestly is so important for that reason that offline we talk about your specific state and what protections you have for survivors. Because again, that's, I think, very much a case-by-case basis depending on what state you're in. Also, this is a very big protection at the federal level. If you are someone who is sharing a lease with the abuser, they can be evicted without you having to get penalized and get told you're evicted. So this federal protection is really important because, one, it's the first time in our country where we specifically spell out that survivors should not be held accountable for somebody else's doing. And also there's this level of control, right? When you're somebody who's in a abusive marriage or an abusive dating violence in a situation, you're basically at the risk at always of losing your housing, right? Various barriers can still exist in your municipality. However, being able to utilize that, I want to call my VAWA rights and let me go ahead and reach out to my fair housing agency. I need to make sure that I get protected under this. The ending abuser's lease, that is so incredibly important as a powerful tool to protect you when you're experiencing violence. Okay, now this is really interesting. At the public housing authority level, and again, keep in mind, this is like your housing authority or the entity that deals with, the programs that like they're responsible for implementing the housing choice voucher program. So like they're the ones that can start wait lists for folks that are experiencing those barriers. So lease bifurcation. So a public housing authority, and this is a law, a public housing authority can actually bifurcate a lease to evict the perpetrator to violence and keep the victims housed. Now, if the perpetrator is the only one eligible for public housing assistance, the victim then has time to establish eligibility or move. This is also incredibly important because think about the fact that if the biggest barrier to being able to keep your housing as a survivor is the possibility that your perpetrator is the one that's committing that violence, and if they're the ones that are eligible for that assistance, then you have the ability of being able to protect yourself and not be displaced as a result of the abuse. So this is incredibly important. Again, I really think that talking offline with Hope about your specific state and what municipality that you work with and live in, that's going to really determine what additional protections you have in your state and municipality. Again, we mentioned this, the specific instances that the VAWA covers. It's people that are subject to stalking, dating violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, or an affiliated individual of the victim. So this is perfectly important, for instance, a child of a survivor, right? If you are the kid of this victim, you are also covered under the Women Against Violence Act. This is incredibly important for families also. Now, this is another thing that's really incredibly important. We know that not all laws protect against everything 1000%. So there's this thing called an actual and imminent threat language. And basically this limitation within this law says that landlords can still evict you if you can demonstrate an actual and imminent threat to other tenants or employees. I'm so sorry about these. I needed to go through this slide one last time. Obviously, I apologize. My caffeine did not kick in when I made these slides. Landlords can technically still, quote, put you out if they can demonstrate that there's an actual or imminent threat to other tenants or employee at that property. And again, VAWA doesn't actually like define what that threat is, But HUD defines, and again, keep in mind, HUD is that federal agency that is also supportive of this legislation, because HUD and all the other agencies that helped, carry this law out, they, define their own version of what that would look like. Now, HUD defines the threat as a physical danger that is real, that would occur within an immediate time frame and could result in death or bodily harm. Again, this is where that survivorship and advocacy comes in, right? If you're receiving support from a domestic violence survivor support services center, you could show through, a case manager, for instance, that can talk about your situation. Like, again, of course, not violating any HIPAA laws. There's always the opportunity where you have your, what's it called? You have the ability, privacy laws, not necessarily HIPAA laws. There's other laws that would protect this person from their identity being revealed. HUD is obviously saying, like, for instance, if you have been threatened by your spouse that I'm going to literally kill you if you try to leave me, that would probably easily fit into this definition. But if it's like a threat that has like no timeline, and there is no way of, definitively telling you that, yes, you in fact are protected because that's that and the third. Again, we know that laws have limitations. And so I just wanted to mention that HUD does have guidance written in that there is specific, defined scope of what a threat looks like. But I do want to make it very clear that there's you have to make sure that you're advocating alongside a case manager. Perhaps you have a family member who knows about this person's history. That's another way that you can define that. Okay, this is another thing which can be very problematic, okay? So we know that in our laws, there's got to be ways that you, quote, prove that you're experiencing discrimination. Unfortunately, this is where the whole law is like kind of low-key discriminatory. Now, if a landlord questions whether or not a lease violation is related to a domestic violence, related to a domestic violence incident, they technically by law can ask for proof. And another way that they could, quote, ask for proof is if there is a conflicting account of which party is the victim. We talked about how domestic violence survivors may have abusers who try to, mess around their story if a police makes a visit to their house. This is, again, I cannot implore you enough. This is where contacting your local fair housing agency is very important. Because if you're possibly on the hook for a lease violation and you end up having to get penalized, and then as a result, maybe you'll have an eviction on your record as a result of that, you do not want to go in there without any legal help. So I definitely urge you to reach out to us so that we can put you in touch with your local fair housing agency to help you support you when you're going through this, quote, proof process. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to sort of, take this information and really process it. There are a couple different things that are, these kind of like proof, the ability of being able to prove what just happened to you. There's this thing called the self-certification form. It's a form from HUD that can be downloaded online, and it's filled out by the survivor themselves. That's where you provide very basic information on the incidences and who was involved. So again, this is something that you're certifying. It's a legal document once you sign it, stating that you experienced this situation, and that could help you keep your housing. Also, third parties. You can also, for instance, if you have had a police show up at your house and you have for instance, you have a service provider that survived, like I talked about the DV shelter, for instance, you could also provide an account basically through a third party that states that you have experienced abuse. This is, again, very easy to do, right? You don't have to have a fancy lawyer. You could literally just contact your local fair housing agency, use maybe you did an intake with that fair housing agency like we do at our agency. Any sort of third party can also vouch that that abuse happened. Well, that's also really incredibly important. Okay, I've been talking a lot during this presentation, and so I want to make sure that I leave time for next steps. So far today, we talked about the rights of survivors at the federal level. We talked a little bit about Illinois law specifically. And again, as I mentioned, I want to make sure that people know that their state and jurisdiction has additional protections throughout the country. And so you can absolutely call a Hope Fair Housing Center at this number, 630-690-6500. And we're more than happy to direct you to your local fair housing agency and additional state protection so that you know what you can do to support survivors. And of course, we really believe that any opportunity that you can, you got to make sure that you advocate for yourself. HUD is another great resource because HUD also has additional resources on their website when it relates to, anything to do really with, your rights as a survivor. They have additional support. So I just want to direct you to those resources. And just for the sake of, any sort of questions or anything like that that anybody might have, as usual, you can contact Hope Fair Housing Center at 630-690-6500, and we're happy to support. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to speaking in the future with you.